Hi. I wanted to open up this presentation by letting you know that I am filming it on stolen Wampanoag, Pokanoket, and Nahagonsett land, land back in our lifetimes, and free Palestine. What does it mean to be queer? Etymology.com explains that in the 1500s, the word queer was used to mean strange or peculiar or odd or eccentric. It wasn't until the 1920s that queer would become used as a word to describe homosexuality. Specifically, it was used as a slur. More recently than that, the word has been reclaimed by people like me and is a word that we use to describe our own identities as queer people. For full disclosure, I I have a script. It is behind the camera on a computer. You're going to see me look this way sometimes. We're going to try to make this as seamless as possible, but it's a lot of words, and I don't have them memorized in my brain. Also, I just kind of ramble. I appreciate you tuning into this presentation. I'm going to try to make this as sort of informational and scholarly as possible. Again, I am just sort of a rambling person, so it is kind of just a collection of thoughts, but I appreciate you being here. This might be sort of holdover English major stuff for me, but I feel compelled to sort of get my thesis out there early. I believe that magic, the paranormal, and everything that sort of falls under the umbrella term of high strangeness is an intrinsically queer space. Whether that is ghosts, cryptids, UFOs, or anything, I think that these are undeniably and intrinsically queer. Now, someone on YouTube did get a little bit mad at me for saying basically this, so I will specify. I don't mean to say, and I'm not trying to say, that you can only investigate the strange if you are queer or trans. I'm especially not saying that strange things will not engage with you and have cool and weird and interesting experiences if you are cisgender or heterosexual. In fact, I think if you just sort of look at the vast majority of people who make paranormal content, the vast majority of paranormal television shows, I think we can sort of comfortably say that cishet people are very comfortably and deeply overrepresented in the field. To be fair, though, that is true for basically every field. I am saying that no matter who else takes sort of part in this field, no matter who else participates in this here, what we're doing, that it is intrinsically true. I'm saying the word intrinsically a lot. That it is undeniably true that the strange, the magical, calls out to queer people. And this is anecdotal, but if you go on Etsy and you search for gay Mothman, you will find infinity results. And a lot of this is that queer people, obviously not all of us, but many queer people are sort of naturally fascinated by astrology and tarot and divination and cryptids and just sort of magical practice. I think that whether we realize it or not, we hear that call, and a lot of times I think we respond to it. My name is Kwiatkowski. I am an award-winning paranormal investigator. That's never not going to be funny for me to say. I just think it's a cool accolade. My magical practice is mostly tarot, and other than the investigating stuff, I'm trying to learn more. I'm trying to be more conscious about the magic that I do instead of just letting magic happen at me as I have for so long. I would love to learn sigils. Hey, if you want to teach me sigils, get at me. I would love to be taught sigil magic. I am the creator and one of the co-hosts of a paranormal investigation docuseries called Liminal. It is an exploration of high strangeness and magic and cryptids through the lens of queer identity, trans identity, specifically identities that are considered liminal. I am a non-binary person. My pronouns are they, them. I think that a lot of people outside of our demographic sort of conceive of non-binary identity as existing as some sort of strange midpoint between male and female, or sort of a bridge between those two things. I would encourage you to expand your understanding of gender identity in general as not being so fixated or attached to or connected to those two binary choices. I have sort of playfully said that I think my gender, in terms of the way that I experience it, is some fairy stuff. And while that is tongue-in-cheek, I do think the best way I have been able to articulate gender as I experience it is through the sort of unknowable and otherworldly magic of the Fae. I think one of the reasons that appeals to me also is that fairies in general are sort of another connection between the queer and the strange. We have been thinking and writing about fairies basically forever as a people. And in the 1800s, fairy became a word that was used to describe effete gay men. A few years ago, I read a book called Transgender Warriors by Leslie Feinberg. Z wrote Stone Butch Blues, which I think is the much more known book. But I was recommended Transgender Warriors by my partner, and I just devoured it. I read it immediately. The book traces transgender people in their roles throughout history, in sort of the ways that we functioned in society across many cultures. Personally, I take some umbrage with applying the label of transgender to people who existed before that label existed. I'm not saying before the concept of expansive gender existed, but before we called ourselves trans. I think that trans is an identity that you have to sort of opt into yourself. You have to say, I am trans. So looking back at someone, even if they are someone that we might call trans today, if they were not sort of aware of that wording, it feels weird to me to say it. I also have some issue with applying it to expansive gender identities and practices and expressions from other cultures that are not my own, because often those gender expressions had their own terminology and their own sort of names, and I think it is more respectful to use those than to sort of say aha, see, trans people. Also, this is the third, I try very hard not to just point at other cultures that are not my own, to be like, see, look, this proves a point of mine, because that feels a little bit disrespectful. None of this, by the way, is a slam on Feinberg. That book was written in '96, I believe, and I think that the way that we approach culture and cultural appropriation and stuff like that has sort of grown in leaps and bounds since then. I do think Feinberg was doing a very good job, and I also think that, I'll say again, if you take one thing from this presentation, let it be that you should read Transgender Warriors. It is, to me, maybe the most important book I've ever read, and I recommend it to basically every person that I can. I do think, realistically too, though, a lot of people, historically, if you were to explain the concept, the contemporary concept of when I say I am trans, I think if you explain that to people, a lot of them would be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That is what I am. I just am not trying to dole that title out myself. I try not to talk about other cultures when I go into the various pre-colonial societies that were sort of accepting of expansive gender identities, but I do feel very comfortable talking about my own culture. I am a mixed race Korean person. The mixed race part is sort of another liminal identity that I occupy, but I am Korean. And while I wasn't really allowed to be Korean growing up, I wasn't really allowed to partake in the culture. As an adult, I have done my best to connect to a culture that is my own, to a culture that feels like me. And especially as an adult interested in magic, I've sort of looked into a lot of Korean magical practice and folk magic. Specifically, I've looked into the mudang, which is a sort of shamanistic role in Korea. It is a person who wards away evil spirits. It is a role that you must be sort of selected by higher powers. You experience sort of a supernatural spirit sickness, and if you survive that sickness, then another mudang sort of takes you under her wing and vets and initiates you in the role. I'm going to be quoting from Pauline Park, who is a queer writer and activist here. Park says, the mudang was the priest-like figure in Altaic shamanism. In that culture, the oldest level of Korean society, which predates the introduction of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism into the peninsula by the Chinese, the mudang was always a woman, but not necessarily female. Park goes on to say, a significant number of mudang were male, and some of these baksu mudang, or male mudang, may have lived as women, as well as performing the sacred rites and rituals of the mudang spiritual tradition. Now, my understanding is that there isn't enough sort of like hard historical proof as to whether baksu mudang lived as women sort of in their day-to-day lives, or if it was just during the mudang sort of practice. But I don't actually think that matters as much, because if you look at it, even this practice of magic, this part of society that is sort of an honored and venerated part, existing as a spiritual healer, someone who would ward away spiritual illness, who would ward away negative spirits, existing as that in that moment involved, for baksu mudang at the very least, these sort of transition through gender identity and expression, through putting on the outfit and the expression of a female role. I'm going to put a link to Pauline's work in the description of this video. It's really interesting. Pauline talks a lot about other sort of queer and trans identities as they existed through multiple Asian cultures. But it isn't just ancient Korea. Before the wicked hand of Western imperialism gripped so much of the world by the throat, many cultures accepted and celebrated gender identities and expression outside of what we imagine that binary to be. In many of these cultures, these identities were not just accepted, we were treated as mystical and magical. We were seen as occupying sort of multiple spaces, right? We were seen as occupying sort of a physical world and a magical world. We were seen as occupying sort of multiple worlds at a time, and I think that really gets towards what I'm saying about liminality. One of the things that inspired me with my show is to think about what it meant to have an identity that is sort of permanently liminal or permanently in flux. This manner of thinking, I think, sort of makes sense with a popular theory in contemporary paranormal space, which is centered around the ideal or the idea of liminality. I know liminal has sort of become a buzzword, right? There's a lot of like YouTube videos that are just weird CGI hallways that are like liminal rooms or back rooms or whatever. But I think there's a reason people are sort of so fixated on it. And this is why I named my show Liminal. This is not, by the way, just sort of a roundabout plug for the show. But if you do want to check out the show, youtube.com/@teamliminal, and Linktree is like linktr.ee/liminaltv. That wink, I wrote it. That's in my script. I did write the wink emoji. That's in the presentation. The concept of liminality comes up a lot these days, specifically in the paranormal. People are really fixated on this idea of places that are permanently in flux, whether they are borders or bridges or hospitals, hotels, places that sort of have a constant influx and outflux of people and energy. Some people think that the reason these spaces sort of attract paranormal experience, like strange and occult sort of energies, is that a great many people are focused on them as doorways, as gateways, and that with that many people focusing on something, and this sort of gets to egregore theory, right? This idea that we can affect things just through thinking about them. That because people focus on these places with liminality in mind, or these liminal spaces with sort of travel and entrance in mind, that they become, you know, portals to other sort of methods of existing. I don't hate that theory. I actually think it's very cool. But I think there's more to it too. I think that like attracts like. I think that the reason that these spaces, these sort of intrinsically liminal spaces, attract the strange is that I believe that the strange is sort of inherently liminal. The strange sort of occupies a very sort of definitionally liminal space. And I'll explain that. This is the part where we sort of veer into the this is just Dash's thoughts. These are just the things that I think. I told you I was going to get a little bit rambly. I don't think that you would be tuning into this and watching this if you weren't at least kind of open to the idea that the world is more magical than, you know, we have been led to believe. That the skies might not be devoid of unidentified shapes and travelers. The woods might not be free of various spirits and beings. I think that a lot of people in the paranormal space are very fixated on finding hard material proof. Like a photograph of the Loch Ness Monster, or a piece of Bigfoot's hair, or some sort of measuring of spectral identity. I want to gently push back on that, at least in terms of my own approach. I think that some things in the strange are, by definition, immeasurable and unknowable. And I actually kind of like it like that. I said earlier in this presentation that I would encourage you to update your concept of gender to existing outside of simple binary poles. And I would like to ask you to do the same thing with your concept of the strange. But rather than male and female, I would ask you to think about the strange with regard to real and not real. And I want you to think about all the interesting space that sort of is bled between those two things and what they can occupy. There's some examples that sort of color my thinking there. I have a friend who is going to hate that I'm saying this. It's fine. I'm not mentioning them by name. We were talking about how queer and trans people experience magic. And I was asking them what their experiences have been. And they got very embarrassed. And they were like, I don't even want to talk about it. And I was like, you don't have to. And they're like, no, I will. While they were bartending, they met a man, a large man with a big white beard, who produced a toy as if from nowhere, and then jovially just sort of vanished. What is real? You know, how do we define reality? Another example, someone was talking to me in the chat of a stream that I was doing, and they were asking me, they let me know that they had a friend who had passed at some point, and they were holding a vigil with some friends. And in the midst of this vigil, when everyone was sort of feeling a lot of strong emotion, a salt shaker flew off a shelf. It just like flew across the room. And they were like, do you think that was a manifestation of the friend and their spirit reaching out from beyond to hurl the salt shaker? Salt obviously being something that is associated with ghosts and ghostly presences, you know, rings of salt and so on. Or do I think that this was sort of a poltergeist style manifestation of the grief in the room, all these people thinking about this person? And I guess I think I think that the question matters of what are we dealing with. The question of what happened matters, but I don't think the answer matters. And that's what I'm getting at in terms of strangeness occupying a permanently liminal space. Because I don't think that you can have an answer as to which of those things happened. And I ultimately don't think that it matters, right? Is it any more magical that your friend would reach out from, beyond the grave to throw the salt shaker across the room? Is that more magical intrinsically than the version of your friend who exists in your memories and your heart and your sort of your care and your emotion, that version who is still your friend reaching out from within you to grab a salt shaker and throw it? I don't think that even emotionally speaking, either one is any more less meaningful or more meaningful. It's still magic, right? It's still something that if you tell someone, so many people in the world are going to be like, nah, that didn't happen. It must have fallen, or there was some other explanation or some other reason. And so I think that strange things sort of naturally occupy this permanently liminal space between reality and unreality, right? And that's good. I would encourage you to think of that as good. I understand that a lot of us want to prove that we're not wasting our time, out in the woods talking to whoever or whatever. But I think that is, that's the meaningful part. And the way that connects sort of for me specifically goes back to queer culture. I mentioned that I'm a non-binary person. I mentioned that the closest I've been able to articulate my gender as I experience it is in this undefinable and maybe imperceptible constellation of fairy things. It's undefinable, it's imperceptible, I have a hard time explaining it, but as I experience it, as I feel it inside of me, it is very, very real, right? So when I say that the paranormal is a queer space, again, I'm talking about likes attracting each other. Amongst trans people, we have a thing called T4T. It's trans for trans. I have it tattooed on my body. It refers to relationships between multiple trans people. It's this idea that when two trans people love one another, there's something uniquely magical and beautiful about that relationship, about that experience. And it comes from a safety. There is safety in being with another trans person. There's safety, there's comfort in not having to explain the sort of the idiosyncrasies of your life and your existence and how you explain or how you experience things. And even if the experience is not exactly the same between those two trans people, there is sort of an acceptance, right? If someone explains the way that they perceive their own gender, the way they experience gender, it's a lot easier for me, the person with fairy stuff gender, to be like, yeah, totally. I'm willing to accept that. And my argument is that this is part of the reason the strange calls to us and we call to it. Strange, S for S, I guess. Strange for strange, or L for L, liminal for liminal. I think that we are drawn to something that experiences existing sort of similarly to the way that we experience existing. I think that something is drawn to us. There are so many things that people have experienced within the strange. There are so many people who have said, I've experienced this, I've met beings that I cannot describe or cannot convince you exist. And there are so many people to be like, no, you didn't. That's a mistake. Something else happened. There's a logical explanation or whatever. But people also do that for gender. People are so quick to dismiss a lived experience that they do not have and they have not had themselves. I think that we are connected to the magical and the strange intrinsically, and I think that it is connected to us. And I've tried to lay out some of the historical precedent for this theory in pre-colonial societies, but even colonial societies. Again, I'll encourage you to read Transgender Warriors by Leslie Feinberg. Specifically, though, check out the part about Joan of Arc and Joan's experience sitting under a fairy tree, being told by voices that the most important thing, the thing that Joan had to do, was to exist in a way that subverted and transgressed gender expression norms of that time. I want to close out this presentation with a clip from the pilot episode of my show Liminal. This is from the second half of the episode, and it is a portion where we interview a lot of queer and trans magic practitioners from the Nashville area of Tennessee, just sort of about their experience and about how they exist in magic and transness and queerness, and just sort of, what that experience is like. But I also want to leave you with a takeaway. The takeaway is to get out there and experience the strange. Get out there and talk to magical things that you cannot see. Talk to them until maybe you can see them. And the takeaway sort of involves you being respectful of those things in a way that acknowledges that perhaps they exist in a very cool, weird bleed space between real and not real. If you are a if you're a cisgender heterosexual person, I am not encouraging you to find like a token queer trans person for your paranormal investigation team. I am encouraging you, though, if you look around the group of people he would invite to paranormal investigate with you, or do anything cool and fun, and all those people are also cishet, I would encourage you to think about what it is that made it so that the people you think about in joining you for cool and fun things also share these characteristics with you. I would especially encourage you to think about that if you and they are all white also. I think that's a whole other presentation that maybe I'll make next year, but I would encourage you to think about it. Now, if you are queer and trans and you're watching this, I absolutely encourage you to get out there and find some people you like to hang out with, find some people you like to do fun things with, and go exploring. See what you can find. Be respectful and be open. And if you do find something fun and weird, email me about it. All of my socials are, or they should be, on this presentation, and I would be very excited to hear about what you encounter, and I would love to talk to you about it. Following this portion, I'm going to put in the interview portion of our pilot. Thank you so much for watching my presentation. I hope that I was able to get you thinking about strange things in a way that maybe you would not have thought about them before. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you taking a second. And may Palestine be free in our lifetime.
Tennessee's complicated. I know everything's complicated, but Tennessee is just very weird. Put it this way, when I was in college, when I talked to other freshmen, depending on what part of the country they came from or what part of Tennessee they came from, they would say, this is the most conservative place I have ever lived, or this is the most leftist place I have ever lived. There's no in between.
It's the first time I've ever lived in a place where really intense evangelical right-wing views were more mainstream.
Luckily, my parents growing up were very real with me about the world, so they're like, it's going to be hard for you because you're not a man, you're not white, you're not this, you're not that. So I've always had a very practical view of those things.
I mean, again, not like people haven't called me fag on the street before, but it feels a little scarier here because I feel like it is supported very much by the culture and by the government.
Nashville has a larger spiritual community than most people would think.
Right.
And what I have witnessed is more people coming together, and they're coming out more and being a little more vocal about who they are and what they want.
The reason I kind of broke away from the church, like a lot of gay trans people, was because of being gay and being trans and just kind of like homophobia, transphobia.
You know, if it's not going to be acceptable, then it's sort of like being pushed out of the church and a certain religion. So
It's always like, are they gonna like the part of me that is gay? Are they gonna like the part of me that is this, that is that?
I really struggled as a young person to even want to have anything to do with anything that looked like faith at all. And I've always had a sort of like internal bristling towards group joining and like believing in stuff, you know, like, oh, I'm gonna like join this belief system. And, you know, at some point in my life, particularly in my 30s, after I started to be dealing with like chronic illness and stuff, really had to like reinvent what faith means and divorce it from like the Catholic Church, for example. You know, this is like my lineage.
And then, but that evolved over time. I mean, now my path is more American folk magic, a little bit hoodoo oriented. So it took me back to the Bible.
I am bad at religion. And also, again, because there's a lot of complicated politics around immigrant identity from countries like Myanmar, where they came from, you know, like violent diaspora and stuff like that, and around assimilation to whiteness in America and assimilation to survive. And so we were sort of told growing up, like, I mean, we would do Burmese things, but we were told we needed to be like, you know, quote unquote real Americans. So we weren't taught the language. I wasn't really taught the prayers, but we were still expected to do certain things, like still expected to not eat pork, expected to observe certain behaviors, certain kinds of filial piety, stuff like that. And honestly, like, a lot of it was sort of not good. And I kind of grew up bucking that a lot.
I'm trying to learn to bring them together because I obviously still have a very strong connection to God, but just trying to figure out how I can bring my craft and him together, because I was taught for so long that magic is of the devil and it's bad, so it's not supposed to do with God.
Accepting myself and not like seeing who I am as like sin has just kind of like opened my eyes to like what is not sin that is part of the world and what is just like humanness. And it has made me kind of like appreciate the world and open up more, if that makes sense.
A low vibe, like negative expression of faith is certainly like giving over your power to authority without questioning. But an internal experience of faith is really about like having wonder and reverence for the incredible enormity of the universe and all of nature and the world, and like not being so narcissistic to think that you know everything all the time.
We call ourselves Episcopagan.
It's just like this general, I don't even want to say apathy, just non-existent awareness that that could even be a possibility. And I think that speaks to a lot of queer experience in the South, but also specifically queer spiritual experience and magical experience.
Sometime in the queer community, we don't feel accepted in society, and we don't fit into these rules and these norms. And in magic, I don't have to fit into those either. So, you know, that is a place I can be myself and do things my way and experience spirit and energy and magic in my own way. And I don't have to follow anyone's rules, so.
I don't think I ever think about it, except for maybe a positive of having a balance of masculine and feminine energy.
Sure.
Other than that, I've really never thought of how it affects it.
I think it affects me more, you know. It's like when I'm working at my altar myself, doing my own magic and whatever, you know, I got my gay on. You know, that's me right there. So.
And I was sitting by a river one day and I heard a voice very clearly, and that wasn't the first time I've heard a voice. That was like, why have you been putting this off your whole life? Like, you know you're a witch, you know you're supposed to be looking into these things, bettering yourself, looking deeper, and then from there, here I am.
I think like all trans people are inherently like master manifestors, even if they have no idea about that or a relationship to it, because at least in my sort of definition or view of manifestation, it starts with a felt experience. It starts with emotion and being connected to a certain energy. And as far as my understanding of manifestation goes, that's step one, you know? So like for trans people, we are people who have the sort of like courage and inner connection to ourselves enough to embody felt states and emotion states that we're not supposed to, and sort of like buck that, and then also bring that into being.